Very welcome in the first place to you, Polly. Wonderful that we could get you here in such a short time. I mean, this was a perfect one-man action. André, he's there, you can't overlook him because he is so tall. André found out that Polly was in Tilburg today and yesterday in Amsterdam. Was yesterday, eh? Yeah. And he said, oh, we're going to try together here in March. And then, well, it's a long story. He found out that it was possible to gather here today. We were in Tilburg a few hours ago, and now she's here. That is fantastic. 2 lectures in one day. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Tonight's program is maybe not what you expected, because I start, and at the end of my speech, that takes about 1 hour and 30 minutes, Polly will have 10 minutes to say hello. It's exactly the other way around. I will speak for about 15 minutes, and then I'll give the floor to Polly, and she will tell you all the things that you and I and we need to know about this planet. Let me introduce myself. For those people who don't know me yet, I'm Dos Winkel. I'm the founder of the Sea First Foundation, Sea with S-E-A, Sea First, the ocean first. And I'll give you a very short summary of what we have done. First of all, I'm not oceanographer. No, I'm an orthopedic physical therapist. That has nothing to do with the ocean. But since my first dive in the Dutch Antilles in 1983, I was overwhelmed by the beauty of the underwater world. And from there on, I started traveling. We started traveling. Betty, my wife, is here today. This year, we are traveling together for 50 years already. We started traveling to many more beautiful destinations where we could dive and where we could also see beautiful nature on land, topside. During all these years, I found out that things were changing. The underwater world was changing, not only in the oceans, but also in high altitude lakes, in rivers, wherever we could dive. I've been diving in many different ecosystems, even in rainforests, and there, the same thing, you see that things are changing, and never for the better. Never. It's always for the worst. Coral reefs disappear, mangrove forests disappear, and in the rainforest, for instance, especially there where they do a lot of mining for gold, there are hundreds and hundreds of species in the water and on land have disappeared because of the fact that people who do the gold digging use methylmercury, and that is very toxic for all life on Earth. So plants die, water animals, aquatic animals die, etc., etc. So I didn't know much about this, and then 20 years ago I decided, after I had contacted many different scientists in the field, so marine biologists, fishery biologists, marine ecologists, oceanographers, many different scientists. I was always surprised about how quick they answered my emails. And then I realized that something was really very wrong. And I had no idea. I only saw the deterioration in the ocean and in the other aquatic ecosystems, and I didn't know. I didn't know what was going on. People sometimes said, yes, there were big schools of fish here, but there was an accident with a factory, and chemical products entered the ocean, and therefore we don't have the fish anymore. In the beginning, I believed it. You know, but after 30 years of diving, I was totally convinced that something else was going on. And this is my first question to you, Polly. Please help us. What can we do against this whole process? Because, you know, first of all, I only thought it is overfishing. because I heard a lot about overfishing. Remember that we have only 3% left in our own North Sea of what we had, and I'm talking about fish, of what we had 100 years ago. 3%. And when there is a little bit more of one or another species, then immediately we start catching more fish. That's what's happening. I didn't know about these numbers. I was told this by Daniel Pauly. He's the world's most famous fishery biologist, marine and fishery biologist in the world. And he started telling me this, and I was really flabbergasted. I thought, how is that possible? How can you empty an ocean that is so big, you know? And then he said, yes, but we have so many people. When I was born, almost 70 years ago, a few months, 70 years ago, we had 2.2 billion people. Now we have 7.4 billion people. That's 5 billion people more. 5 miljard mensen meer. And that is in no time. What is 70 years in the history of the earth? So we are depleting not only the ocean, but many other things. Because what's happening now is really ununderstandable almost. You know why the ocean is so important? The ocean is extremely important because if I may quote the most recent scientific paper, it says that 3/4 of all the oxygen, and in former papers it varied between 50% and 80%, but the last paper is the most scientific paper, and it says that 3/4 of all the oxygen that is produced by plants is produced in the ocean, by the plants in the ocean, by the phytoplankton, het plantaardig plankton, by the phytoplankton. And now we know, that's a study of Boris Worm, also a very well-known, world-known, renowned marine biologist, that about 40% of the phytoplankton has disappeared already. That is our main source of oxygen. So what are we doing? How does it come? Why is the phytoplankton disappearing? And now we know. It's disappearing because of the acidification of the ocean. And the ocean is acidifying, verzuren, de verzuring van de oceaan. According to many scientists, this is the biggest threat that exists for all the animal life on Earth. From the tiny little worms and insects up to the people, up to men. And because if we don't have enough oxygen, we die. It's as simple as that. And this is what is happening at this very moment. There's a very interesting study that says that the more carbon dioxide, CO2, the more carbon dioxide we produce, by the burning of fossil fuels, for instance, the less oxygen we get. It replaces the oxygen. So this can't go on forever. We are in a hurry. Something has to change, and really quickly. Therefore you're here, Polly. Therefore we invited you, and you are going to tell us what we can do. And everybody can do a little bit. Everybody. We can all turn that knob a little bit until we fully turn it to the right side. So, the phytoplankton is dying. The ocean is getting more and more acid. The pH, the zuurtegraad, is going down. It's a fact. We are measuring this in thousands of places in the ocean, and that is at least going on for 50 years. So we know exactly that this is going on. And if the ocean gets more acidic, then calcium dissolves. Is it dissolves or resolves? Dissolves. Yeah, dissolves. And that's a big problem, because plankton, the main source and the base of the whole food chain, the main source for food in the ocean, the plankton consists also, the phytoplankton, the tiny little plants, partially of calcium. And the calcium is dissolving. So we're destroying the base of the food chain in the ocean. And if the ocean is dead, then we die, because then we don't have enough oxygen or there must be created, we must create much more place on the top of the Himalaya, of the Mount Everest. And we should live there with oxygen mask, etc. No. Now I'm kidding. Although I'm not kidding completely, because there is an Australian scientist who recently wrote an article, and he said, do we have enough oxygen by the end of the century? And he said, well, if we go on consuming the way we do now, and I don't mean only food, but the more we consume, and that could be anything, electricity, etc., etc., the more carbon dioxide we produce, the more methane we produce. That's a very important factor. You know that rainforests are disappearing in an amazing speed. It's 1 hectare per second. And Bertie and I, we have seen it all. We have seen it happening everywhere. Not only in the Amazon rainforest, where you find soy and corn plantations, and where you find millions of cows, where there used to be giant trees with enormous canopies taking up tons and tons of carbon dioxide and giving back oxygen. So it's so important. So the word that we need to remember tonight is green. Although the planet is blue, we have a blue planet. We have much more ocean than we have visible green on land. But we need the green. We need the oxygen. We need the plants in the ocean. We need to restore the rainforests. We need to restore the mangrove forests. About 90% has disappeared. Mangrove forest that can withstand partially, for instance, hurricanes, tsunamis. They can stop. Do you remember the tsunami in 2004? 150,000 people were dead, were killed by the tsunami. And then after months later, scientists started to ask themselves the question, why? What happened? Why? Because we've had so many tsunamis in the past. How is it possible that this one killed so many people? Because the mangrove forest has disappeared. And now they start replanting mangrove forests. Yeah, of course, we have to wait a few hundred years. We have time. But we are in a hurry. So we have to replant the rainforest. And then, you must have heard that methane produced by cows and other animals, farm animals, that methane is more than 20, some studies say even 60% more climate toxic than CO2. We can live up to a certain level with carbon dioxide, but we cannot with methane. Methane is one of the worst, not one of the worst, the worst greenhouse gas that we know. It will make the world warm up much faster. So, what can we do against all this? What can we do about deforestation, Polly? That's my main question. And what can we do about the pollution of the ocean? Not only because of the acidification, the plankton dies, the phytoplankton, our main oxygen producer. No, also all the other things are dying. The fish is dying. And so many other living creatures, plants, animals. What's happening with biodiversity? So we need to do something against deforestation, against ocean acidification, against overfishing, against crazy bycatch and discard. You know, bycatch, what people catch, what the fishermen catch, and what they don't want to have, or what they are not allowed to land, bring on land, to land, and they throw it back in the ocean. And that we are talking, Polly, at this moment about 45 billion kilos of animals, seabirds, pinnipeds, like seals, for instance, and lots of dolphins and many, many other species of fish that die as bycatch, and they're thrown back in the ocean. 0.02% survives. And many fishermen say, oh, most of the animals survive because they've only been in the net for an hour or so. Yeah, with 10,000 fishes on top, they're suffocated for a long time already. So there is something very wrong. And my question tonight, Polly, and I would love to give you the floor. Everybody has read about you. I'm not going to give a big introduction about you. You're the lawyer of the earth, and you're going to explain us how come that you got this title that you gave yourself, that people gave you. I'm an ambassador of the ocean. You're the lawyer of the world, of the earth, and you're against ECOCIDE. And I have mentioned in this introduction, in this very brief introduction, many kinds of ECOCIDE already. ECOCIDE, het om zeep helpen van prachtige natuur. Yeah, sorry, that was a Dutch, very short explanation. Polly, I'm so glad, grateful that you're here, and here's the mic for you, and good luck tonight.
Thank you, Dos. Thank you. So DOS sets me a challenge, really. What can we do? Thankfully, I do have an answer. But before I get to talking about ecocide law, I'd like to look at the causal reaction and connection here that we have. Do I need this, by the way? Or can you hear me without it? No, it does help. Okay, fine. This is about looking upstream to the causal connection of many of these problems that we're talking about, whether or not it's acidification, whether or not it's overfishing, whether or not it's plastic in the seas. If you start to look at the causal linkage, which is very important in law to see what is happening here, what it does tend to take you to is some form of dangerous industrial activity. Acidification, you're looking at the cumulative impact of the carbon majors, those majors in the transnational corporation world that are contributing the most to the atmosphere in terms of carbon emissions. Now those carbon majors are well known, and in fact there's some fantastic research, a huge body of 8 years worth of research undertaken that identifies the top carbon majors in the world, and it only comes down to 68 companies that are the major contributors to carbon emissions. That's quite remarkable. Most of them tend to be fossil fuel companies or heavy extractive industry. But again, if we look at fisheries as a form of ecocide, if you like, follow that causal link. What's behind it? You know, what are the big companies that are undertaking the illegal fisheries practices? I was explaining to Dos earlier in the car on the way here that in the UK, over 70% of the fish that actually is brought into the UK is termed black fish. It's been illegally landed one way or another outside of British shores. That's a huge high level of fish that's actually coming into fishmongers. But by the time it actually lands in the UK, there's no way of actually showing that because it's changed hands in international seas. It's gone through ports with illegal permits or permits that have been falsified. And it also has those who should be governing the seas receiving backhanders to allow it to pass in a blind eye. So we have problems here where it's not just corporate engagement here that's to be questioned, but also it's to do with the very governance as well. This is about the officials that are involved in a corrupt system, but this is also about a political system that's not taking action, the lack of enforcement, and the lack of enforcement at every stage, whether or not it's over in Africa or whether or not it's coming in through, for instance, Rotterdam. Or into London, indeed. Where can we actually start to bring in an intervention that will disrupt this pattern of harm that's playing out time and time again? You know, the dumping of plastic at seas. Yes, there's a cumulative impact with every bottle that's just tossed recklessly into the waterways. But also there's another kind of plastic and pollution that goes into the seas, where there's actually the offloading of waste just dumped by ships into the seas, which nobody knows about because it's not seen. Likewise, the dumping of waste fuselage, of the actual oil and fossil fuel that's used in ships. Because this is the problem, once you've travelled your ship right across the high seas and you enter into a port, you have to pay to have your redundant fossil fuel removed from your ship. So much easier to dump it out in the sea before you enter into the port. So we have a problem here where there's a system of harm that's playing out that requires a governance of a different system. Because at the moment, the biggest problem we have is that it's not a crime. A lot of this is not an international crime, or where it is recognised as a crime, it's not being enforced. Or if it is recognised as a crime, it's in a piecemeal fashion. It may be that you have some criminal activity around illegal fisheries, but if it's not enforced on the Ivory Coast, then it ends up being transported into Europe, and it's lost in the process as to what is illegal and legal. There's a kind of washing through. And by changing its illegality into it being legal by dint of putting a different label on the very box that's carrying that illegal fish, and so that it's actually allowed to come through into our consumer process. For me, when I first started examining the issues at large of our world, the significant harm that was playing out, what was happening to our oceans really had a huge impact on me. I hadn't appreciated at first just how enormous the problem was until I, in fact, discovered the huge issues behind ocean acidification. That was utterly remarkable. I knew about fisheries. My husband, he is a lawyer as well, and for a number of years he was one of the top experts in the UK for UK, not just for UK, but for international law of the seas. So fisheries was something I knew about through my own husband's work as a QC, a Queen's Counsel in London and the UK. But the whistle has been blown now. You know, the experts are out there. We know this through climate change narrative. We know this through the climate negotiations. This is not something that's unknown. We know this through the oceanographers, through the climate experts. We understand that incredible nexus between our health and well-being as individuals and the health and well-being of our very planet and the health and well-being of our very water and what happens within our oceans. So what can be done here? Well, this is where ECOCIDE law plays a huge part. Now, ECOCIDE law is a law that acts as a protector's law, if you will. It's a law that does two very important things. It criminalizes dangerous industrial activity. And if we're looking at that chain and we go upstream to where that activity is starting, is triggering the problems downstream in the oceans, then it's about significantly abating those carbon majors, that activity. It's a dangerous industrial activity. We know that, we can see that. But it's doing more than that. It's also about creating a legal duty of care. And that's very important, because at the moment we don't have an international legal duty of care for our Earth. It's missing law, if you will. It doesn't exist yet. So this is a law that actually does a number of things. What it does is it gives governance, it gives protection, but also it provides prevention as well as prohibition. Now, prohibition is very important when we begin to recognize that something is so significantly harmful that we cannot go there anymore. We get to a stage where we say, enough, no more. And I'll give you an example of when we did that before in history. We did it with genocide. We got to a point and we said, this must stop. This is so wrong that we must criminalize it. We don't regulate it. Regulating would therefore imply that it could continue in a limited context. That would be mad to say, yes, you can commit genocide, but just so long as you only kill 2 million people a year, that's okay. That would be mad. But we're doing that with our seas. We have regulations for the seas. Yes, you can kill our seas to a certain level. Problem is with regulations, it's very easy to sidestep and override them. It's very easy to continue with practices that cause harm until caught. It's a game of catch me if you can with regulatory provisions. The good guys will do the good stuff, if you will. But those who don't care, those who are looking to expand their profit margins, it becomes all too easy to start short-circuiting the circuit and start taking those routes that will bring in higher profits, whether or not it's through illegal fisheries, whether or not it's through illegal dumping, whether or not it's continuing with the dangerous industrial activity that we know is causing that significant harm. Now, there's something that I just discovered actually the other day, and in fact we were talking about it earlier today and yesterday, and it's called the governance pyramid. And it's a way of understanding where we are within a legal framework, the way we attend to how we address problems of our times. And there are 3 stages to a governance pyramid. At the bottom end, you have what's known as soft law. And these are the agreements. They can be agreements that maybe business comes together. United Nations Global Compact is a very good example of a soft law provision. There's an agreement there. But it has no legal teeth. There's nothing to actually ensure that something is done if a company or individuals do not adhere to what they've signed up to. In fact, we have an awful lot of conventions that are kind of quasi-soft law documents. We are signatories, and I think you are too, signatory, yes you are, to the Convention on Nuclear Non-Proliferation. And yet, in the UK, we hold annually in the O2 Centre in London a big conference where you can come and buy and sell nuclear weapons. Because you know what? Hey, it's not a crime. To make weapons of mass destruction is not a crime. Isn't that remarkable when you think about that? Now, it may be a crime in wartime that they're being put to use, but it's not a crime to be in the business of making weapons of mass destruction. So there's a problem here, especially if we're signed up to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that we can allow proliferation of nuclear weapons regardless. And it ends up being a worthless document. The Paris Agreement, that does not have any enforcement mechanisms built into it. Neither does the Kyoto Protocol. These are big international documents that have no enforcement mechanisms within them that will actually prevent and prohibit and preempt whatever it is that's causing the harm. So this is a problem that we have here. We have over 500 international treaties that deal with the environment one way or another, and I've read many of them. They don't have enforcement provisions within them, most of them. Now, the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas was written in the 1980s. And when it was a very innovative document in its time. In fact, it still remains innovative in some ways, but it's in desperate need of being updated. And when it was first drafted, what it did was it used trusteeship provisions. It embedded in it duties and responsibilities and obligations. Now, back in 2009, I spoke and was legally advising into the climate conference, the climate negotiations up in Copenhagen. And if you remember, out of that came something that was deemed a disaster. Everyone was calling for a strong, legally binding agreement. But what was meant by it being legally binding? Nobody asked that question. And I read the document as it then was, the Copenhagen Agreement, before it became one page. Before it became one page, it was 94 pages. But it was 94 pages that didn't really assist. In fact, what it was a trading document. It was all about how money could be made out of climate issues. And I took the UNCLOS document, the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, and I decided to word check between the Kyoto Protocol, the Copenhagen Agreement, and the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas. And I put in 3 words: responsibilities, duties, and obligations. Under UNCLOS, for the seas, responsibilities 78 times. Copenhagen Agreement, Kyoto Protocol, 1. UNCLOS, duties, I think it was 128 times. Copenhagen Agreement, Kyoto Protocol, 0. What was the other one? Duties, obligations. Obligations, put that into UNCLOS, I think 67 times. Kyoto Protocol, the Copenhagen Agreement, 0. This was very telling in legal terms, because actually what was happening with the climate negotiations was that it was dealing with a trading document. It was really about ownership and property. In fact, it was about how we could create trading mechanisms, and indeed we do have that within the climate negotiations context. But nowhere was it actually identifying what our duties and responsibilities were. All it stated was that we have common but differentiated responsibilities, which now we're 21 years on with climate negotiations, nobody can agree what that term actually means. And there are a lot of lawyers in the room at these negotiations. So here we have a document that actually is looking at the seas through the lens of being trusteeship and guardianship principles. But in fact, what's happening with climate negotiations, and the same with the Paris Agreement, which very interestingly, if you compare what came out of Copenhagen, the Copenhagen Agreement, and what came out of Paris, those 2 documents are almost the same in content. But what happened in Copenhagen was deemed a disaster, but in Paris, we lowered our expectations so much, we hailed it as a success. But what is the success out of a document that all it does is it gives us an agreement that we must try and restrict our greenhouse gas emissions to an increase of 1.5 degrees increase in temperature? Well, it does help us in this regard. It helps us because, in fact, we have almost every country signing up to that document. And that's a document of knowledge. It's an understanding that in fact we do have a duty of care. And that duty of care that's recognised under the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas is now recognised within the climate context. But it's the enforcement mechanism. And likewise with the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, which actually requires an even higher level of enforcement than it has. And it has limited capacity, but it does have some capacity. Unlike climate negotiations that has 0 enforcement whatsoever. This is where ecocide law can actually bring these two arenas together, climate change and the law of the seas, by creating an overriding legal duty of care by an international crime of ecocide. So there's a hierarchy to law as well. When you look at it through the lens of law, you have state law at a national level, then you have international law. But within that, you then have international criminal law, and that supersedes all other laws. It acts as umbrella law, if you will. So you can't have your head of state turning around and saying, you know what, we're going to go and gas all those people in Breda because they're sitting in this beautiful place discussing a really radical law here. Of course not. That would be recognized as a genocide. Couldn't be done. Well, it could be done, but what you'd find is that the state would step in and intervene to prevent that from happening, because it's a crime, and it's an international crime, and it's recognized as such. And that's very important. International crime imposes certain duties and obligations at a state level, which a state must then respond to and take action underneath. Ecocide law criminalizes extensive damage, destruction to, or loss of ecosystems. Actually, the biggest ecosystem of all is really our seas. When that goes, then our lives go too. So there is an interconnectedness here. So this is a law that has huge, powerful force for the seas. And I think actually, more than any other arena, this is possibly the most critical point of all. And for me, it also is very close to my heart, because what I'm finding when I talk about ecocide law right across the world is that the Western world politically isn't really engaging with this. We don't have a very visible problem happening in front of us. We don't have ecocides playing out on our land in the same way as, say, you have in Central America. We don't have climate issues in the same way as, say, Pacific Islands do, with rising sea levels, tsunamis, floods, cyclones. We don't have land grabs happening by another form, land grabs by rising sea. But when you're on a Pacific state, a little Pacific island, a little atoll, and the land that your people and your people's people have lived on for 50 generations suddenly disappearing underneath the sea, then it's very real to you. And it's very real to you as well, where your local fisheries, your local practices of going out in little boats, and you're finding that no longer can you actually find any fish in your sea because it's becoming acidified. No longer can you fish because there are huge mile-long trawlers that go in there and shore up the seabeds and then dump it back out when it's not the right type of fish. Those who are at the cutting edge, at the very edge of where it's most adversely impacting humanity, those are the countries that really require ecocide law. In truth, we don't really require it. Others who are really feeling the adverse impact, they do, because for them it's a humanitarian crisis, an existential humanitarian crisis. It's estimated that there will be 650 million environmental refugees by 2050. It's a huge number. And to give that context, we have at the moment 20 refugee camps in the world. The largest one is in Colombia. It houses 1 million people, 1 million people. Now, it was set up as a temporary camp 20 years ago, and people are now living and dying behind barbed wire. What do you do if you have 650 million environmental refugees? Build 650 more camps? What do we do? This is not a humanitarian response to a humanitarian crisis. But what we can do is we can actually stem and stop and significantly abate the dangerous industrial activity that will lead to that ticking time bomb in just 35 years' time, less. By actually stopping the dangerous industrial activity now, it has huge impact right way down that causal link to those seas. Stop that dangerous industrial activity and you're abating the escalation of greenhouse gas emissions. But not only that, in fact, what you're doing is you're significantly abating the pollution into the atmosphere, the pollution into the water, the pollution into the land, the destruction of people's livelihoods and ways of living with their communities. That is a cultural ecocide. Can this be done? Well, that's a very big question. It's something that I'm gifting my life to make sure that I see something happen in my life. We were talking in the car coming here, just as Doss believed at the very beginning he could effect great change, and then you get to a point of thinking, is anything ever going to change? Can we do something here? And I'm sure you, like I, have hit those walls where you feel utter despair at what you're seeing in the world. But you know what? I genuinely believe we can. Change is always possible if we want it. And each and every one of us can bring unique skills into bearing to make that happen. And whether or not that's a conversation, whether or not that's something that we can do to help effect change in whatever little way, it sends ripples out right across the world. By deciding to do what you do, Doss, you've taken that message out to many, many people right across the world, millions, I'm sure. That's so important, raising the awareness. Now, I'm just a lawyer. All I'm doing is I'm taking my unique skills as a lawyer forward and saying, actually, I know how we can put this law of ECOCIDE in place very, very fast. It doesn't have to take 21 years through climate negotiations. All it requires is one head of state to stand up and say, I call for the Rome Statute to be amended to include another international crime. We don't have to create a new treaty, we don't have to create new documents around this, it's just a simple amendment. That can be done. In fact, what I want to see is strengthen this, where those small island developing states that are most adversely impacted, like the Pacific Islands, to stand unified with this and say, collectively we call for this, because that'll be so much stronger. That's what I would love to see happening. And that's what I want to really bring to you today, is that there are ways forward here. And indeed, those conversations are happening, which is fabulous. But at the end of the day, all I can do is legally advise. I'm not the head of state. For a head of state to stand up and do that takes incredible courage, especially if you are a state that is lacking in funds and lacking in political leverage, which a lot of these small island states are. But this is the good news. Unlike climate negotiations, an amendment to the Rome Statute, if you're a signatory to that document, you only have one vote per member state. So it doesn't matter if you're the size of Canada or if you're the size of Vanuatu, for instance. It's one vote. And it's a 2/3 majority vote that can have this law put in place. But even before it's put in place, everything takes action, everything starts to change, because suddenly it's on the horizon. Suddenly you have an awareness that this law is going to happen in due course. And what happens there is that the flow of finance shifts very fast, the flow of investment shifts, and business starts recognizing that this is a business risk that they have to bring into their own analysis and decision making. Do we continue on with an industrial activity that's going to cause an ecocide that could be deemed a crime in 5, 10, 15 years? Or do we change our practices and start aligning ourselves instead of, for instance, dirty energy to clean energy? What we do is we shift norms. Instead of it being the norm to continue with dangerous industrial activity, it becomes the exception. And we start seeding a different ways of doing things. Now, this is also about how we investigate crime as well. And we are living in an ever sophisticated world where we can use satellites, where there are ways that we can actually combine the expertise of the oceanographers, of the climate scientists, to understand what evidence can be brought to bear to bring cases. The evidence is there in legal terms. The law, we know how to put this in place. It's not impossible. And I'd like to leave you with this thought. I have a friend who has an impossibility list. Whenever he comes across something and he thinks, oh, that's impossible, he's got a little notebook and he writes it in there. And he goes out into the world to challenge himself to show that, in fact, it is possible. And this is the thing, is that the impossible can become possible. And indeed, I've seen it many, many times. And we all have, in truth. And to give you just one example of that, very good friends of mine, when Barack Obama was campaigning to be the first black American president of the United States, my American friends were over just before the elections. And I said, do you really think it's possible that you will have the first ever black American president? And they said, no, it's not possible. Not possible. Now, you know what? 3 weeks later, he became the president of the United States. And when I spoke to my friends, their answer to me saying, but you said it wasn't possible. And they said, no, of course it's possible. Look, it's happened now. Oh, and by the way, yeah, of course we voted for him. But this is what happens. The impossible does become possible, and it shifts our framework of what can be done. Now, this may sound like an impossible law, but I tell you now, no. It is completely possible, and what's more, it's required. All it needs is some strong political will and a little bit of funding. And I think we can do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. I'm sure you have questions, and you will have the chance to ask questions to Polly or me. I want to thank the Grand Theatre, de boekhandel. Waar is Gietje? Oh, daar. Gietje, fantastisch. Thank you so much for giving the opportunity. To use this beautiful building, because it's a fantastic building. And it's not a theater anymore, but we can perform. We are performing right now, so that's nice. And for occasions like this, it's a perfect location. I want to thank you again, André, because at the end there is not so much time to do all these things. Again, thank you so much for organizing this. This is fantastic. And also for the food that you brought. Yeah. We had wonderful food that André bought just around the corner, not far from here, from Loff. And Loff, and that's a fantastic vegetarian vegan restaurant. So that was great. I also want to thank our main sponsor. Usually they want to stay anonymous, but they're here because an organization like See First cannot work without donations, sponsors, etc. And our main sponsor, that's Amanprana. And that's a company that makes the most amazing products, all vegetarian, vegan. And they're here tonight. Thank you so much. Yeah. And most of you have obtained already a folder, a brochure with their products. Polly, now we'll continue. You know, I said something about consumption. And I would like to know more about that. I would like to have your opinion. I told already that there are some recent studies that have shown that if we eat less meat and less fish, then we can change the world already a little bit. We can maybe even replant the rainforests again. I mean, we have overflown the rainforests from Rio de Janeiro to Panama City. There was about 1.5 hours. 1.5 hours was beautiful rainforest, pristine, and then 5 hours it was only soy and corn plantations and cows, and millions of cows. And all these cows produce methane, and the trees that were there once cannot catch the CO2 anymore and cannot produce the oxygen that we need anymore. So what can we do about that? Yeah. Would you like to sit?
Yes, shall we?
Maybe, yeah, it's nice. I never sit, but that's on these chairs, it's nice. What do you think? Can we do something about that, or is that impossible? Or
this is another very good example of ecocide. The destruction of the Amazon is escalating currently. In fact, we saw figures on this just last night in Amsterdam. But also, it's the disruption of an ecosystem that is absolutely vital to the Earth itself. One of the biggest problems with deforestation, whether or not it's for growing monocrop plants like soy or whether or not it's for cattle grazing, is that by taking out the very lungs of the Earth, in fact, also then it's depriving us of from the rainforests, the rain clouds, which are absolutely vital for the Amazon, so that in fact the whole ecosystem has been disrupted to such an extent it's starting to falter and malfunction. So this is equally the same as the seas, the disruption of the ecosystem. And indeed, the farming practices there are utterly inhumane farming practices, if it's right to say inhumane. What would be the right word for that to apply to animals?
Just simply disgusting.
Keeping cattle together and force feed, it's a kind of form of force feeding, if you like. And a lot of soy production is in fact for cattle. So I think it's about 70 or 80% is actually being forced into the animal food processing system. It's a mad system. Once you start to look into it more and more and more, you can only sit back and say, this has to stop. And destruction of the Amazon is a very good example of an ecocide. Mm-hmm. Bringing evidence to show the ecocide there is not difficult. You can even go onto Google Earth and you can see the level of the destruction of the Amazon. 20% of the Amazon is now gone in the last 20 years. And it's escalating. So where are we going with this? It is a matter of actually drawing that red line legally and saying enough, no more. I'm very conscious that we are getting to that tipping point. You know, we talk about planetary boundaries and what happens once we go over there. And yet, I also know this as well, when you step back from interfering from nature, and this applies to the seas as well, the restoration that can actually happen incredibly fast. Or we can even step in and assist with that. If you look at the Loess Plateau in China, which is an area the size of England, that was brought back into biodiversity from being a very hostile terrain. It was completely desertified within a period of 8 years. Wow. And you know what? It cost less than it cost to make the film Avatar to do that. You know, so we're talking about money at a level that, you know, people make blockbuster films out of that can be actually hugely restorative. But there are restorative practices out there that we know to use. And indeed in fisheries, we know when there are no-go zones on certain waters that biodiversity returns incredibly fast and begins to flourish again. Yeah. My husband has always said this about the law of the seas, that actually it's not rocket science. At the end of the day, you don't even have to be a lawyer to understand this. Just stop fishing. Let it return to its biodiverse natural levels, and only go back in there once you've worked out how to do it responsibly. It's quite a simple, it sounds a very radical approach, but if we do want to take responsibility for this, in fact, and if that means changing what we're eating, that's a form of adaptation. That can be done. If that's what it takes, I'd be happy to do it. I am vegetarian anyway, but nonetheless, I'd be happy to, become vegan if I felt that, that one difference could make a huge intervention. And this is the thing with interventions, is there something that we can do to disrupt this pattern of harm that stops it in its tracks? And I think this is what ECOCIDE law really does. It allows biodiversity to come back and flourish once again, because you stop the harmful practices.
Thank you so much. There are many people who say, well, you and me, we're vegetarians, that's good, that helps. Everybody can start eating less meat or fish or none, would always be better, of course. But it really helps. You can even do some arithmetic and find out immediately how much CO2 you save if you become a vegetarian or a vegan, that's even better. But many people say, well, I'm eating already much less meat. I started to eat fish. And then I have to explain to them that's maybe even worse. Well, because what we know now, and what I think is really important, and I didn't know, there was a study about 5-6 years ago maybe, and it's called Fish, an Ally Against Climate Change. And that was totally new. Nobody in the field of ocean science knew about it, but fish take up CO2 when they open their mouth. When water enters the fish, it always includes CO2. And the CO2 comes out again in the form of gut rocks. Tiny, stony structures, because, fish poop is half fluid. And there are always those tiny gut rocks in the fish poop, and that goes down to the deep sea. And that's a way of storing CO2. And nobody knew about it. Now it's common good. Everybody knows it in the field of marine science. So fish is an ally against climate change. But if we have only a few percent left, it's really a bad thing to eat wild fish. That's the first thing I say. I'm not saying you shouldn't eat fish anymore. No, I'm just telling you what the consequences are. And then many people say, yeah, but I only eat farmed fish. Farmed fish. Well, the conversion between wild fish and farmed fish, because most of the farmed fish is carnivorous. Carnivorous means they can only live if they eat other fish. But where does the other fish come from? From the wild. 38 billion kilos, another number, 38 billion kilos of wild fish are caught annually to feed farmed fish. So if you buy 1 kilo of salmon, 1 kilo of salmon, in the best case, you eat 2.5 kilos of wild fish. Usually it's 5 or 6 kilos of wild fish if you eat 1 kilo of salmon. For tuna it's much worse. They can't farm tuna, but they can fatten them. They catch them and they put them in big, what do you call it? Tanks? Yeah, no, it's in the open ocean. Een kooi. Ja, no, it's metal. What do you call them? Open kooien in het water? Cages. Thank you. Cages. Open cages. And if you eat 1 kilo of tuna, you eat 25 kilos of wild fish. So what are we doing? So these are things that most people don't know, or that I didn't know, but I know now, and now I look at things differently. So, but Polly, imagine we have these huge trawlers, mega trawlers. The Dutch are very good in having mega trawlers. Parlevliet van der Plas, I mentioned them by name. They catch tons and tons of fish with one net. You know, these nets are as big as, you can enter 13 Boeing 747s in one net. That's amazing. And they have a lot of bycatch. And they throw per day about 100,000 kilos dead back into the ocean. What can you do about that? I mean, there was a program made in the Netherlands, SEMBLA made a program about it. And what can you do about that? That's a form of ecocide, I would think.
Yeah. This is really about criminalising the dangerous industrial activity. At the moment, this is not a crime to do this. This is really problematical. There's some regulatory, and this is going back to the governance pyramid, where first of all you have soft law, then next what you have is regulatory law. Well, if caught, then there may be a fine to pay, but that's just factored in as an externality. Maybe get caught 100 times, well, you know, that just is an added cost that's passed over to the consumer, the end consumer. So regulatory is all about compliance, regulations put in place, and it's also about cooperation. But of course, if you're out there and your fishing practices, by dint of necessity of making huge profit, you're just going to bypass those regulations on the basis that, hey, we'll pay off every once in 100 we're caught. Or another trick is to close down the company overnight and open up under a new name and start operations all over again, therefore bypassing any responsibility whatsoever. And this is common. This happens. This is not uncommon. So then you go up the governance pyramid. This is then when you're stepping into the criminality, because then you're holding individuals to account in a criminal court of law, and the state then has a duty to take action and take those prosecutions. When you're at a regulatory level or civil litigation level, then in fact it doesn't really work very well, especially if you're having to chase companies. But as soon as you can prosecute individuals, then it's a very different aspect that you're looking at altogether, because you can, in fact, the very threat of being imprisoned for undertaking something that's causing significant harm can act as a very powerful deterrent in its own right. Other aspects can be brought in as well. At the end of the day, locking up people only gets you so far, but you can bring in restorative justice provisions. And that I think is very important, how we expand the remit of criminal courts to deal with restoration issues as well as part of the sentencing provisions that can be put out there. And actually saying to a company, okay, now you have a responsibility to do good, to put back in the harm, to ensure that you help in the clean up operations, say if there's been oil spills or what have you, and to finance that. And that doesn't matter if it's going to dent your profits, no matter what. There's, certain orders can be made to ensure certain things are done. So we're looking at how we move up that governance pyramid, if you like. And it is just a matter of time, if you will. This is the next logical step as to where law will go. We have to move forward because we're recognizing that that interim level is just not sufficient. There has to be the next iteration of that. And then what we'll see is that, in fact, it will become deeply unattractive to play those cat and mouse games because the finance is not going to flow into it. Because actually within society it becomes recognized as a criminal activity, which fundamentally changes our approach to how we choose to engage or disengage with those sorts of practices, corporate practices. It's very interesting. If you think about it, once upon a time, theft was not a crime. Until somewhere along the line, it was decided, this is a very bad idea, going around stealing stuff. We're going to make it a crime. Because actually the state then recognises that there's a certain level of protection that's required for society at large. Likewise, grievous bodily harm. Likewise, murder or homicide. And so then we move into the international arena, genocide and apartheid. And really it's just a logical progression that we will get to a crime of ecocide. It's an expansion of our cycle of concern. It's no longer just human-to-human engagement. You know, theft, murder, you know, these are all offences against the person, if you will. Crimes of aggression, you know, that's to do with human-to-human interaction. But what we're doing is we're looking at human to non-human interaction, how we interact with the earth itself, with nature, with the seas, with the atmosphere, with the forests. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
Regarding this aspect, because things are counted. One of the directors of VW in the States is brought to prison because of the pollution of the cars. This is an example of exceeding the borders.
Yeah. So, which case is that you're referring to?
VW, the car company,
Yeah.
has malfunctioned.
That's right. Yeah.
And it will cost VW 4 million.
Yeah. Yeah.
What they love about it.
Yeah.
One of the directors in America is brought to prison.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's on fraud charges, I think. Now, there's been some very interesting research that's been undertaken by Colorado University where they looked at environmental protection provisions in law to see how it had any impact on corporate activity. And what they discovered was that existing environmental provisions, because it tends to be within dealing with fines or regulatory provisions, have no adverse impact on a company. At the end of the day, you pay your dues, you continue on with business as usual. It doesn't have an adverse impact on your share pricing. If it does, it's a momentary dip and that's it, back to normal. But criminal prosecutions, where you take a prosecution against the CEO or director, has huge adverse impact against a company. And that can change practices within a company. And what they looked at was that fraud charges, because it's criminal, worked. And so their conclusion was, in fact, you need to bring the criminal prosecutions into the arena of the environment. The corporate crime is missing when it comes to environmental issues. Yeah, and that's a very good example of it. Yeah.
So then another question. We spoke about pollution of the ocean, pollution of the environment, topside also on land. Plastic plays a main role. There are so many solutions. I mean, we can make plastic out of sugarcane. We can make plastic out of seaweed, out of maize, corn, out of many things, potatoes even. And you get a few presents from us. This is a plastic bottle that is made from sugarcane.
Oh, okay.
So we try to let everybody use bottles like this instead of plastic bottles. This is sugarcane. If we throw this in the ocean, it will take some time, but in the end, it will be like plankton. It will be green. It will be plant-based completely. Nothing wrong with that. And plastic, of course, is highly toxic. Very bad for the ocean, very bad for the fish and all the other animals that live in the ocean. You may have read this study from Wageningen University past year, that in one portion of mussels, more than 1,000 particles of plastic. That's amazing. See? So, and there are places in the ocean when there is more plastic, I call it plankton, than phytoplankton or zooplankton. So that's crazy. But these are the Coca-Colas of the world that are responsible. So, of course, we can encourage everybody to buy this. That's good for Sea First also. It gives us €2.50. But yeah, but we have to start, of course, with the big companies, and we have to convince them boys, please stop. But they are so close to the oil companies. You know, they make all the plastic from the oil. So what can we do about that? There is some movement, I know, but it's not enough and it doesn't go fast enough.
Plastic is a byproduct of oil, of the oil industry. Yeah. So this is again the causal linkage. Where do you turn off the tap? Stop fossil fuel extraction, you stop the production of plastic. Right. And in fact, you know, I envisage that one day we're going to get to a place where plastic becomes a precious material, and that we'll in fact be harvesting it out of the seas to put it to good use, because we recognize it's going to be around for thousands of years.
Millions
so
of years.
Use it carefully and wisely rather than as a disposable product. Mm-hmm. Again, this comes back to ECOCIDE law. You create an international law, it changes practices virtually overnight. It's that simple at the end of the day. You can go around and ask companies to do something, but at the bottom line, a company is governed by law today that says you have to put the interests of the shareholders first, which means to maximize profit. It is virtually impossible to stop heavy industrial activity, such as fossil fuel extraction or plastic making, when you don't have a level playing field. You turn around to an oil company today and say, look, you should be just doing renewables. For a company to do that means that, in fact, it has an adverse impact on their bottom line, and in law, they have to put the interests of their shareholders first. And most shareholders don't want that. Mm-hmm. So this is a real problem. This is about actually providing a law that will give assistance to those companies so that, yes, it's mandatory, they then have to move out of that which is causing harm, but it creates a level playing field so that every other company has to do the same. And that allows them then to sit in the boardroom and say, we have to do this by law. And everyone else does too. And what's more, that government will only give us permits to go into renewables rather than into fossil fuel. Those investors will only finance that which is non-harmful. Mm-hmm. And our shareholders will only support us providing we do that which does not cause harm to the earth. So it's a law that helps companies as well, because at the moment, goodwill is not going to do it. It's not enough for companies that are hidebound by law that has actually entrapped them in a system, a pattern of harm that's almost impossible to step out of. So this is one of the biggest problems we have. Goodwill alone is not enough. It has to have the leverage of law behind it to move it very fast. Yeah.
And how long do you think, how much time will it take before we can have laws like these? What do you think? I mean, you're still young. You're a baby compared to me. I mean, you have much more time.
Charming.
What do you expect? I mean, you see change. I see changes. In the 10 years that I'm busy with this work, I see changes, positive changes. But how is that in your work?
Yeah. You know, when we were coming here, I was saying to Dos about how one of my great heroes is William Wilberforce. He was the man in the UK, an independent parliamentarian who really advocated for the abolition of slavery. And he was 28 years old when he decided. He sat underneath an oak tree, and he had a huge moral dilemma. You know, he'd been asked by the Quakers to take forward the mantle of campaigning for the abolition of slavery, and for him this was a huge undertaking, and he sat underneath this oak tree and had a conversation with the tree, in effect, saying, what should I do? And he wouldn't move from underneath that tree until he was decided in which way he was going to go. And eventually at nightfall he stood up and said, okay, I'm going to stand and fight for the abolition of slavery, no matter how long this takes me. Now, you know what? They passed the first of those laws 2 days before he died. So he died a happy man. Now, he doesn't have Facebook or Twitter. We do. I think we can move far faster. And also, I mean, we're dealing with laws here. Law has evolved in certain ways. Every country in the world can pass emergency legislation overnight. You know, George Bush shored up Wall Street. We've used it for terrorism provisions, for instance. Many countries have used it many different ways. We have this presumption that laws will take many, many years to put in place. That's not necessarily the case. When there's an emergency, you can use emergency provisions in law to pass laws literally within hours. It's just a question of whether or not you have decided that you're in an emergency situation. Now, if you look at these small island developing states and climate change, it's not long until we get to a point where we say there's an emergency here. And that's very important. And here's the thing with an emergency is just a state of emergence when something new can be put in place. So it can be a really good thing as well. It's a moment, it's an opportunity for something great to happen. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yes, a question.
That goes back to the bottle.
That goes back to?
To the bottle. Sugar cane.
Yeah.
Turned into a plastic, not really being in plastic. Well, plastic oil is also bio-based. It's a bio-based product.
Yeah. This is bio-based on plants.
Yeah, but bio-based on oil. Oil is a natural product too.
Yeah.
But it's the change in the
Structure.
molecules.
Yeah.
Changing molecules.
Yes.
Made it into plastics
Exactly.
that caused it not to be able to break down ever.
Exactly. And it's very toxic also.
But
Yeah.
but sugarcane bottles, their molecules are changed by human, and them too have the same problem.
No, because there is no toxicity involved. So there are no toxic compounds. When this falls apart in the ocean, it will take like 6 months or so, then there is not even one toxic element in the ocean. And that's totally different from plastic made out of oil. So it's a good question. I asked it myself also. I wanted to know exactly how they were made, but this is just, it's...
Yeah, but you can't use it for more than a couple of months.
You can use it, I don't know how long you want to live, but you can use it for 80 years or so. This.
How is it possible to break down the ocean then?
Because of the sun, the wind, and the movement. It's always the combination of sun, wind, and movement that makes plastic, that makes it fall apart. And that happens with all kinds of material that ends up into the ocean. It falls apart because of the movement, the sun, and the salt water.
It's also proven already.
Yeah.
Very into plastics.
Yeah.
That biodegradable plastics take longer to biodegrade in the ocean than on land.
Yes, but in the end it will fall apart into tiny particles, and even if fish eat them, it won't change anything. I mean, if fish eat plastic particles, it will change a lot, because in the old days we never found wild fish with cancer, for instance. Nowadays we find many cancerous tumors on wild fish. I know we know it from farmed fish because of all the toxic compounds that they get, but from wild fish that was unknown. And nowadays it changes a lot. So they catch lots and lots of fish with cancerous tumors. Because I wanted to ask Polly one very short question, and then it's up to you people here. Do you know, Polly, who protected most parts of the ocean since ever?
No.
No, Barack Obama. During his period of his presidency, he protected more waters, more ocean, more surface of the ocean than anybody else in the world has done so far. So that's fantastic. So do you know him?
Personally, not yet.
Personally, not yet. We have to go there. We have to see him after he is finished very soon, because I want to bring him to the Netherlands and to Belgium. I want him here, and I want to make a fantastic symposium.
Get him in here.
Yeah, here is nice. No, but we need many more people because everybody wants to see him. Okay, questions. So, who has a question? You are first.
Yes, thank you. You made a comparison with genocide, first there had to be a really global catastrophe, 6 million people killed in Europe, and then we thought, oh, well, that's not such a good idea, let's stop doing this. And we said to each other, never again is this going to happen. But the worst genocide was in the 90s in Rwanda. And if you look at what's happening in Turkey in the First World War, they say, no, this was not genocide, it was just killing a lot of people. So so it's essentially two questions. First is, do we have to have a real catastrophe? Or is the emergency you refer to, is that enough to start this process? And second, how do you prevent people saying, no, this is not ecocide, this is just normal? Where do you draw the line?
Yeah, very good points. I hope we don't get to a point that it's such a catastrophe. You know, we have the knowledge now, and I think also the Paris Agreement is very interesting. For the first 6-7 years that I was advocating ecocide law, I said it was a crime of consequence. But now, actually, I've shifted my position. It's a crime of recklessness and sometimes of specific intent. And it is a crime of recklessness when you have almost every country in the world signing up a document that shows that they have knowledge of the direct connection between dangerous industrial activity, human-caused emissions, and rise in temperatures triggering climate change. So there's that side of it. We may, I don't know, I'm not a futurologist, so I can't say whether or not it's going to be as a result of a catastrophe. The conversations I'm having at the moment, hopefully we're going to get there before that point. That would be really fantastic, but who knows? That ultimately is out of my hands. What constitutes an ecocide? Well, this is really a question that really taxed me when I was first drafting ecocide law. How do we give it shape? What do you sign off as an ecocide? And I looked to the existing international crimes. We have genocide, we have war crimes, we have crimes against humanity, and we have what's known as crimes of aggression, the run-up to war. Crimes of aggression has been put in place in 2010. That's when it was tabled. And something happened there that I really learned from. The drafting of crimes of aggression had been a process. In fact, it's called the Princeton process because it was undertaken behind closed doors, mainly in Princeton, or it started there with a number of state actors coming to the table. It went through various iterations, and at the very 11th hour, it was fatally compromised by America, largely, coming in and saying no, they wouldn't have this, they wouldn't have that provision, and so there was a lot removed at the very last minute. And indeed, crimes of aggression is compromised law. It was watered down quite drastically. Now, how do we prevent that from happening this time round? What came out of crimes of aggression was essentially a checklist. And a very simplified checklist where a lot that's on that checklist is now redundant because it was very specific of what you had to use, a specific type of weaponry, and therefore that would apply for crimes of aggression. But you know what? Those weapons are no longer made. They've evolved into something even more sophisticated. So checklists don't work. to say it has to be a forest or it has to be oil extraction, it has to be fracking or has to be mining. That doesn't work. You can reinvent that, you can change the name, you can change the practices, you can take it to another level. What matters is to identify the harm itself and give it parameters. And my proposal is that the parameters we use is size or duration or impact. It's called a disjunctive test. It's either or, whether or not it's something that's over a certain size. And indeed, we already have this test in existence under the Environmental Modification Convention, which was put in place after the Vietnam War, when it was recognized that using Agent Orange, White and Blue was really a very bad idea, and that if we continued with it, we really wouldn't be here today. So NMOD, as it's known, was put in place with a disjunctive test because it was recognized that if you just ban Agent White, Orange and Blue, someone will reinvent it under a new name. And instead, it said the size, the duration or the impact of the harm will determine whether or not it should not occur. And that's the test that I've applied for ECOCIDE law. Size is 200 kilometers or more. Duration, it's very interesting. The adverse impact is whether or not it knocks out an ecosystem for a season or more, if it's over 90 days. Because if you knock out an ecosystem for more than 90 days, it will take decades and sometimes centuries to be re-established. You know, look at the Amazon, for instance. Look at the ancient arboreal wetlands and forests of the Alberta, the Athabasca Peace Delta. Impact. An impact, a severe impact, a significant impact, and that's not just human impact, but it's also non-human impact as well. And that you can bring evidence in a number of different ways. What that allows you to do is to look at every ecocide on its own evidential basis, because each one will be unique. And it allows then for the evidence to be brought forward to say, this has been an ecocide because of its size, or because of its duration. You may knock out an ecosystem, but it may not actually be a huge size, but the ecosystem itself has huge significant adverse impact. Duration or impact. The impact itself may be significant elsewhere. You know, if you're looking at atmospheric pollution, for instance, something can happen in one continent and have adverse impact on other continents. DDT, for instance, which is now banned, you know, it still turns up in the breast milk of Inuits who have had absolutely nothing to do with big industrialized agricultural farming practices that used DDT back in the 1970s. And here we are 45 years on and it's still turning up in breast milk. So this is really important, that we don't box it into a way that just becomes some simple checklist, because people and industries will reinvent that wheel. But if we go to the harm itself and say there are the parameters, then we can look at each on an evidential basis. Thank you for that.
Was that answer short enough? Sorry. Yeah. 1, 2. Yeah. You were first. I don't think I can reach that far, but maybe you can come forward.
Okay. I have 2 small questions. So, for international waters, how does the ECOCIDE law works? Because now nobody owns the international waters, so you can fish what you like, as you like. And the second question is, does this ECOCIDE law helps you to, for instance, forbid trawlers of a certain size to start fishing as a means, because it's a means of ECOCIDE? Can you ban that?
The proposal of the drafting is dealing with the impact. So you're looking to the impact, it's evidential. What is the significant harm here? So it doesn't matter so much what size your trawler is. There's a lot of regulations that may then have to be amended as a result of ECOCIDE law. But what matters is the adverse impact. And also what's very interesting, and certainly it's a principle we understand in law here in Europe, is the cumulative impact. So when you're looking at, for instance, let's take the Amazon, for instance. There are a number of actors that are coming into play there that's causing the significant harm of the deforestation of the Amazon. You could be looking at those who are doing the illegal logging, those who are doing the so-called legal logging that actually have permits or have fake permits. You can look at those who are then using the land for soya or palm plantations. You can look at those who are then doing heavy industrialized agricultural practices using lots of chemicals and pesticides. There's the cattle farming, you know. There's even a phrase now called cattle crime. You know, all of this can create a cumulative impact for an ecocide. There are a number of different actors that you could be looking to prosecute. Who do you choose to prosecute? Well, it's not so much about how you determine, therefore you can only do this much or this size. But instead, what you're doing is you're fundamentally changing the framework of what's allowed and what's possible. And that's very important for a company to go in and decide what it's doing. Now, let me give you one industry where this will be a very telling piece of legislation. Fracking, for instance. Yeah. Now, of course, what you often hear about fracking is, well, it's only going to be so many wells, you know, let's say 10, 12 wells. So the harm, the environmental adverse impact is negligible. Well, for instance, our government wants 60,000 wells to be drilled in the UK within the next 5 years. Well, suddenly the adverse impact is no longer negligible. It can be really significant. And we can look for the evidence of that elsewhere. You can look to America. You can look to Australia to say, okay, what are we looking at in terms of adverse impact here? What is the size? What is the duration? What is the impact? How does that adversely impact the water tables? How does that adversely impact farming practices? How does that adversely impact communities? How does that adversely impact the biodiversity, the animals that live on that land? And so it goes on and on and on. In fact, there's a growing body of evidence that you can pull in, and academic research and scientific research that's been done on this that shows that, in fact, this is going to be of huge concern. And certainly when you're looking at the cumulative impact, it's an ecocide. So this is the thing, it doesn't come down to whether or not your practices are here, but if you're sitting on the board of a company that is looking as an energy company to enter into fracking, and you've got ecocide law looming over the horizon or it's in place, your first question to the board will be, will this contribute or cause an ecocide? And if so, we can't even go there. Because yes, you may start out as a small company, but of course you will have an expansion policy, you know, and one day you're going to reach that level. But you may well be contributing to a greater ecocide that is the cumulative impact of having a dozen other companies doing exactly the same thing. So it's very important that it's not limited. That's, again, that kind of boxing exercise that, oh, your practice, your industry can only do X amount, or it's only this size. It's to look to the harm itself. That's just one form of measurement. You know, there are many different ways of actually bringing the evidence to the fore to choose that. But I think this will happen with international crime of ecocide put in place, and we do this indeed with many laws. You put one law in place at a certain level, so for instance European directives, you then have to, if it runs counter to national law, you then have to go to the national law, and it used to be a red pen, and you draw a red line through the national law that runs counter to the regional law. So we have a European directive transposed into the UK for timber regulation, for instance. There's one that's just been brought in 2013. We have to then look at our own national legislation to see what it is that may run counter to that, and then that has to be amended. So I think it will have huge impact for instance, on the size of trawlers at the end of the day. But it won't be through the primary legislation, it'll be through the kind of trickle-down secondary legislation that will come from it. Yeah.
Nobody owns the great ocean, so who's going to enforce it?
Forgive me, yeah, very good point. This is a problem. This is a really big problem. And this is governance. This is global governance. And also global governance actually catching up with the 21st century. You know, using satellites, using ways of doing this. And also this is about how we take the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas and actually take it into the 21st century. That document is no longer sufficient for our purposes. It's not enough. You know, it's no man's land once you get 12 miles out into the sea. So this is actually about how we rethink our existing laws of the seas as well. I agree with you there. This is a huge problem. International criminal law ultimately has a very powerful role here. It doesn't mean that all of this will stop overnight, because it has to be tackled from a number of different avenues. But it fundamentally shifts and sends out a very powerful message as to where we're going with it. And I think actually there's an awful lot more that has to be addressed under that umbrella of you know, the UN Convention on the Laws of the Seas. I mean, there is actually a court that deals with issues to do with you know, international regulatory issues of the seas. It's not enough. It needs stronger legislation, and it needs to step into the realms of serious crime. You know, prosecutions 4 years and more constitute serious crime, and also dealing with complex criminal cases as well. Some countries actually have special courts now dealing specifically with complex criminal cases. Funnily enough, in Europe, we don't yet. But I think that will be the next step that we need to look at as well. Yeah. And also an international criminal investigations unit, environmental criminal investigations unit that deals with the environment of the seas as well. I think that'll be very important.
Thank you. One last question. I'm sorry, you were there for a long time with your hand. One last question, and then you may have the chance to talk to Polly, because we will be hanging around for a while after this, after the end of this meeting. So it's yours.
Thank you. I would like to know what you think about this struggle for ecocide law. Does it need people to get organized? Does it need social movement building? Do people need to go on the street and inform other people? Does the idea need to spread? Or is it simply something of lobbying the world leaders? And if you think that the organizing of the people is important, what should be their goal?
Okay, thank you. This is really the last question, and then Grietje? Waar is Grietje? Er is nog een drankje achter, zo, toch? Er is nog een drankje, dus voor iedereen die dus een boek koopt is er nog een drankje. Wat? Vergis ik me weer? Okay, I said there is a drink for everybody, and I said there is a drink for everybody who buys a book. So, your last answer.
You know what? This needs a campaign. It's really as simple as that. I'm just a lawyer. You know, in truth, I really am just a lawyer. I'm not running a big NGO. I don't have that capacity. We have a small, really core team who actually managed to make a heck of a lot happen here in the Netherlands. Katie Shaker, can you stand up, please, so that everyone can see you? And I'd like you to give them a round of applause. And there are one or two others here as well who really input to what we're doing. But we're a core team of people that are really very much wanting to take this far further forward. And it's gotten to a stage now, I think, that there is a requirement for an international campaign here, without a doubt. Now, that also needs leverage from those NGOs and organisations that already have those inroads to run a big international campaign. And indeed, this is such a global issue. I don't think it's even a job for one NGO, it's so big. I think this is about collaboration and bringing in a rather unlikely alliance of different organisations to take it forward. And I would love to see different organisations that bring special expertise like yours coming together with, you know, the Friends of the Earth, the Greenpeaces as well, but looking out to those smaller NGOs that really have strong impact to take this forward, and working with other actors like IUCN. I think they're going to be very important in this. Wildlife Justice Commission as well. I think that's a very important organisation that's recently set up, and helping to take this forward. Now, of course, to actually build and create something that will have huge global impact as a campaign, that requires a bit of funding. And here's the rub. This is a proposal to put in place an international law. That's not a charitable endeavour. In my country, you can't gift me money through my charity for what I'm doing, because in effect, under the UK Charity Commission, this is not a charitable endeavour. I'm wanting to change law. So I'm reliant, and I think we're actually getting to the stage where no longer awareness raising, and once you put out a campaign for this, because we're calling for a law, we are reliant on the radical funders, if you like. Those funders who believe that this will really change everything, that will really get behind this and help fund this. So thank you for your question. If any of you out there are part of the kind of rebel alliance of radical funders, I'd love to meet you, please. Please do come say hello. And not just that, you know, there are many ways that we can input into this, but I think the time is coming that we're getting ready to put together a really, truly great campaign. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And as many of you know, we made many books. This is still wrapped in plastic, unfortunately, but it's the last book. I think there is one more, but it's the very last book out of many thousands. I try to give the animals of the ocean a voice, and I try to give them a face. And this is Faces of the Deep. It's 100 portraits of beautiful sea animals, and photographed by me, and I hope you like it.
I will, I do. Thank you. Thank you, God. Really.
Okay.
I shall treasure it. You have to sign it.
Yeah, we will. I will sign it for you, of course. And you need to sign one of your books for me. Yeah, it's present time. So, Katie? You're very important also. You're Polly's voice in the Netherlands. And please come up for a second. And I would like to give you a beautiful plastic, non-plastic bottle also. Thank you so much. Yeah. En Gietje, kun jij ook even naar voren komen? Ja, nou moet je ook komen. Als je naar de Wereld Draait Door gaat, dan kan je ook hier komen. Toch? Je hoeft geen boek te bespreken, maar Gietje is de bezieler van deze prachtige boekhandel. Ik geloof dat jij ook nog iets wilde geven.
Polly, I'm so proud to have you here. And I think we can see and we are aware that the audience was very well into it, into your message. This is for you. I hope you will use it, and I hope you will write more books than you already did. And I hope you had a lovely time in Holland.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Oh, thank you.
En we hebben voor jou ook nog een cadeautje, maar dat komt vooral van André weer, maar die is er niet zogenaamd. Nee, oké, kijk eens. Dit is een glazen fles. A glass bottle.
Yes. Okay.
Not plastic.
Okay.
But also
So I can
very
reuse
sustainable.
it.
And this is something to eat. Also very sustainable. From Andre. Thank you very much. Thank you so much again for having us use this beautiful place.
Please feel invited. The drinks are over there, and this is the house, the bookstore of the stories. So please feel invited and tell everybody your stories, because I think that's important. Yes.
We will. Thank you so much. Now, okay.
And before you start drinking, last but not least, I want to give you, Dos, a present. Yeah. But you are the moderator of this exciting evening. I'm very proud to have you here, Polly also. I have what is this? A piece of paper where you can do your shopping, your grocery with an organic store in Breda. So, have fun. You have eating tomorrow. Thank you very much. Big applause for Dos.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. And then, ladies and gentlemen, have your drink, have your book, but I would like to have the equip of the Salt magazine here, because there you are, because there is a small photo moment now with the magazine Salt, and that is very interesting because about a week ago somebody called me and he said, you know about the quote 500, and there is now a quote, another, well, whatever. About 70 people were elected by the readers, 25,000 readers or so, of Salt magazine, the top 70 in the world. And there is Barack Obama, and there is Polly Higgins,
Polly Higgins as well.
world famous,
Here you are.
lawyer of the earth.
Hold the magazine.
Don't you are.
Hold the magazine, and time for a picture? Can I be on the picture also? Oh, okay. Thank you so much. And to my surprise, I'm in it also.
You're in it.
I'm in it, and you also. I'm next to Barack Obama. That's fantastic, huh? Yeah. Yeah. How nice, how nice. Okay, Polly, thank you once again. And it was a lovely evening, and I've learned a lot. I heard, well, 2 different lectures actually, in Tilburg and here. It was quite different because of the ocean, of course. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. Thank you so much for filming and taking pictures. Hopefully we have some nice stuff for Facebook and so. And we'll send you also some pictures. Yeah.
Thank you.
Have a nice evening. Thank you.